Welcome back to Proxy, everybody, and today we're going to be talking about the most popular competitive Eldar builds in 10th edition. So, as we get closer to our codex coming out and the realization that only the Blood Angels still have their official codex to be released, before, of course, we get our own codex, the meta has pretty much settled in to what it's probably going to be for the rest of the year. Having said that, I thought it would be interesting to talk about the evolution of the Aeldari in competitive play throughout 10th edition, and what builds we were honored to see throughout that time. However, I do want to make a quick announcement discussing the Wraithblade video that I told you guys I was going to be coming out with very soon. Unfortunately, Adobe Express decided to basically corrupt the file and make it impossible for me to actually download it onto my computer. So, full disclosure, I am going to have to obviously re-record that video, and that is probably going to take me another couple of days to do. So I do apologize about that, but, don't worry guys, it is coming, and it is coming soon. Alright, so let's go ahead and talk about what we're going to be discussing in today's video. We're going to be looking at the competitive history of the Aeldari in 10th edition so far, and the most popular build archetypes in Pariah Nexus, and the general strategies behind each one. So let's take a moment to go back in time and look at the very beginning of the edition, the announcement of 10th, and the subsequent release of the new edition. Now, when I was making content in the very beginning of the edition, kind of before we got access to the rulebook and the different indexes and stuff like that, we were kind of hanging on to the different reveals that GW was releasing on the Warhammer community website. And when the Aeldari rules dropped and we saw their army rule and their detachment bonus, people went absolutely nuts. And keep in mind, this was before we really knew any of the data sheets or, kind of anything like that. We really didn't know a lot about the army in general. We just knew the army rule and the detachment bonus. And my thoughts on it were, well, if the detachment bonus and the army rule are pretty strong, then the data sheets must be balanced around that, right? There's not going to be any really broken interactions, It's going to be like it was in 9th edition, where we had a pretty cool army rule, and, we had pretty cool detachment bonuses and stuff like that that could be very strong, but it was balanced around the fact that we had, expensive units. And in general, we really weren't a very tough army, so, being able to pass a save here or there wasn't that big of a deal. However, my words of let's just wait until the index comes out before we make any judgments did not age well at all, because it turns out that the people doing the points for the, Aeldari at the time were completely out of their minds. The cost of a lot of our anti-large units, and especially the units that could deal devastating wounds, was way too low for what they could do with the army rule and, of course, the, detachment bonus. Units like the fire prisms and D cannons were super low in cost, and you could pretty much afford multiple fire prisms, multiple D cannons in the same list. You pretty much had whatever you needed at whatever time you needed it when you were building an Eldar army. And possibly the greatest example of this abuse was the Wraith Knight. So the Wraith Knight being able to use the devastating wounds, which by the way back then worked differently. It basically killed everything because mortal wounds were applied a single wound at a time. So if you did, let's say 14 mortal wounds with your Wraith Knight, normally now that would be just, 2 Terminators dead, just massive overkill on those 2 models. But back then it was applied one by one. So the Wraith Knight could effectively kill everything in the game, and it didn't even need line of sight to do it usually because it had the towering special rule. So if it could physically see the units, which by the way, the Wraith Knight's a very tall model, so seeing, enemy large units and stuff like that behind ruins was fairly easy. Then of course it could shoot it and therefore kill it. There was no target that was safe from a Wraith Knight, let alone 2 Wraith Knights, because they were cheap enough at 375 points-ish. I think that's what their cost was back then, to basically be spammed. You could run 2 of them, you could have Farseer support, you could, use as much Fate dice in a turn as you wanted to. It was the absolute Wild West, those first 4 weeks where we just had our indexes. There was really no bug fixes or patches or balance anything, right? no balanced data slates. It was just pure raw power. And I tried out so many different types of builds during this time, and I can just tell you guys that almost every single build I tried was good. I even ran a Corsair army at the time, and they even seemed powerful themselves, despite the fact that they were one of the weakest units in the index. So, yeah, the Eldar were very broken, both at the casual level, at the semi-competitive and competitive tables as well. That is without a doubt. At least if you were running the Wraith Knight and you were running some of the other kind of broken stuff that the Eldar had access to, like Wraith Guard and stuff like that. Just because of the fact that Devastating Wounds as a special rule really was just totally broken. And of course, the Eldar had the most access to this ability, so, of course they were going to be the strongest faction in the game. However, this would not be that long-lived. GW would soon, nerf the points of a lot of Eldar units, kind of bring them more into line with the rest of the factions in the game. And they would also nerf the Towering and Devastating Wounds ability. Now, they didn't do this until a little bit more further on. They waited first for a points change, and then, of course, in the next balanced data slate, they actually did change the rules in the rulebook. So we were waiting a little bit for that. But when it finally came, Eldar players basically just started running more Fire Prisms because they were still pretty well costed, Warwalkers, and D-Cannons instead, especially D-Cannons. Because, of course, D-Cannons were, still a little bit cheaper at the time. I think they brought those up to 105 points, if I'm not mistaken, by that point. And, they would only get nerfed from there, as we know. And this was also around the time, September-ish, when we started seeing the Wraith Brick appear more and more in competitive lists. People had dropped their Wraith Knights, but they still wanted a powerful control piece that could deal devastating wounds, because this was, kind of a very important thing in competitive play at the time to get around really good armor and really good invul saves. And there was a few broken mechanics with the Wraith Guard at the time. Of course, you had the powerful Fate's Messenger Spirit Seer, which could, change a dice to a 6 for a Wraith Guard. You also had the ability to, shoot into combat because you had the pistol keyword attached to your ability, which was also really powerful. And of course, as a result, people ran this a lot in their competitive lists. And it was one of the boogeymen of competitive play. If somebody wanted to beat an Eldar player, they really had to figure out how to beat the Wraith Brick, right? There were ways to do it. Clever positioning, clever play could bring down the Wraith Brick, but it was difficult, especially against good players. So, of course, GW nerfed the Wraith Brick. Not only did Wraith Guard get a points increase, but their ability got nerfed as well. They, of course, lost the pistol keyword. They also, kind of lost the ability to take Fate's Messenger. Fate's Messenger now only affected the model itself, not the unit. And this would have the almost immediate effect of most competitive builds kind of shying away from the Wraith Brick, right? It was becoming a liability. You couldn't fire anymore as well at the target that you wanted to. You had to kind of shoot at what shot you. So it lost a lot of its controllability, especially against, high-level players. And this led to a huge diversification of Aeldari list archetypes, many of which we still see today, despite the many subsequent changes. And I will say this was the point where people started really leaning into aspect warriors. And, we really started to see some really strong aspect lists enter competitive play. So although we still did see Wraith Guard and the Avatar of Cain and, those kind of really tough units, and we still see those things today, we definitely saw a lot less of them, and we did see a steep rise in people using all aspect armies. Now, with this, we also saw the rise of another kind of toxic type of list around the same time, and that was the triple Night Spinners with the Yinkarn. So if you guys don't remember this, people were basically tripling up on Night Spinners, running them with the Yinkarn, and then essentially just bombing people with indirect fire. And this was kind of the, short-lived age of the Night Spinner being really OP. The Fire Prism just got nerfed, to 180 points. People weren't as willing to spend that many points on, Fire Prisms in their army at this point in time. And at first, the Night Spinners were significantly cheaper than the Fire Prisms. Fire Prisms got nerfed first. They got brought up to 180. Night Spinners at the time were still 145. And then Night Spinners, of course, in a later patch got, also increased to 180 themselves. But people still played them. at that 180 point cost because they were just so strong. Being able to just stop units from advancing was crippling against some factions. Factions like Orcs, who definitely needed the advance roll during their wall turn to be able to reach your lines. Also, fast armies that could advance and charge could no longer really do so effectively against triple Night Spinner builds. And it kind of became this really toxic type of list where people really didn't like playing against it. And I had a few experiences myself where I was only running double Night Spinner and I was getting a lot of looks from people. And actually in one case had an Orc player who was probably kind of more on the casual side really be quite upset at what the Night Spinners were doing to his, beloved Orc army. It was honestly kind of feels bad because I was actually meant to meet another person that I was going to have a game with, and that game would have probably been much closer, but, he didn't show up, and I ended up just getting a pickup game against somebody that had already kind of had his army set up and everything, and, it just went from there. But yeah, Night Spinners were very oppressive against a lot of armies out there. And when you paired it with the Yinkarn, you could pretty much pick up any unit you wanted to on the battlefield and just teleport the Yinkarn to it. The Yinkarn also wasn't nerfed at the time. You could teleport as many times as you wanted to, free of charge, whenever a unit was destroyed, whether it be friendly or enemy. And that was also just really, really strong, especially when you could just kind of pick up units at will. So, both of those units obviously eventually ended up getting nerfed. People were running that build in competitive play, and it was just absolutely dominating certain opponents. And then, of course, after those nerfs, we did start to see, again, another resurgence of Aspect Warriors. We started to see Harlequins appear. We started to see Wind Riders appear because the meta was also shifting more to a, marine meta, a mech meta, if you will, over the previous tank and monster meta. And this was just largely due to the fact that a lot of the anti-large tools that armies had were getting much more expensive during this time. People were running these in triplicate. If you look at early Space Marine lists, if you look at early Imperial Guard lists and stuff like that, they were pretty much running a bunch of heavy-duty anti-large weaponry. Not that Imperial Guard were much of an issue for competitive play, but they did have some of the best indirect fire in the game, bar none, and that was really oppressive in some matchups. So, yeah, the Guard win rate wasn't great, don't get me wrong, but they were still really powerful and, I think very underrated for, much of the edition. To be completely honest, I think that they were much more powerful than people gave them credit for early on. Now, when Pariah Nexus arrived, despite a rocky start for the Aeldari. Now, I called this early on in Pariah Nexus. I said, you know what, guys? Pariah Nexus is going to be our expansion. It's going to be great for the Aeldari. We have secret missions. We have these better battlefields that are going to just, open up so much to us. We have a lot of great secondary missions that we can score on and things like that. They're just, the sky's the limit. I was so excited for Pariah Nexus. And I really do love Pariah Nexus, I have to admit. I stand by all my statements. I think Pariah Nexus is better in general for the Aeldari. Unfortunately, we just got nerfed hard right before the actual expansion came out, right? Like right when Pariah Nexus came out, a bunch of our stuff got hit with points nerfs and stuff like that as well. So a lot of the units I was telling people were going to be just absolutely supreme in Pariah Nexus did get the nerf hammer. We saw Warp Spiders get nerfed, and they were a unit I predicted would be the best unit in Pariah Nexus, pretty easily too once I saw the deployments. Wind Riders caught a bit of a nerf, being that their ability now has to satisfy both conditions to get the full rerolls. They have to be the closest enemy and on an objective to be able to get those full rerolls. So a lot of people, when they bring Wind Riders, also bring Guide with them now just to ensure that, which is kind of a weird choice by GW because they, came out with an FAQ even before that stated for Necron Destroyers, who have the same exact ability, that, each separate kind of part of that satisfied conditions on its own. So essentially part one of the rule, being able to reroll ones to hit against the closest, was its own thing and didn't affect the second part of the rule, which was rerolls all hits on units on objectives. So I did find it a little weird that GW kind of went back on their previous FAQ ruling for the Necrons and just changed it altogether in Pariah Nexus. I don't know why that was such a big problem. I thought that was, fine. Basically, it gives you an incentive to shoot units on objectives and stuff like that. But, they did catch a slight nerf, but Wind Riders are still very good, of course, even in Pariah Nexus. But we did see, some minor nerfs to other Aspect Warriors and things like that, would have been really, really cost effective in Pariah Nexus. So we did see a couple nerfs, of course. We did have kind of a hard transition into Pariah Nexus because of all the assault armies that all of a sudden became super powerful. And a lot of the Aeldari builds, competitively speaking at the time, just really couldn't deal with these armies, right? Things like Blood Angels, Space Wolves, where, you just didn't have the damage or the kind of aggression to be able to deal with some of these, hard-hitting, very fast, assault-oriented units. And once you kind of start to dive into the math, it really is quite apparent that a lot of our tools just are not effective at dealing with units that have Feel No Pain or invul saves. So that is really hard to deal with. Things like Vanguard veterans with jump packs, were really hard to deal with because they had Feel No Pain. And, you layer that with things like Armor of Contempt and cover and stuff like that, and you start to see different scenarios that are really not favorable for Aspect Warriors. And, if you look at Thunderwolf Cavalry, I think it's a very similar story. Aspect Warriors just don't trade that well against them in general for the points, at least at the time. They have been nerfed since, but, and I think they're going to be nerfed again because that's pretty much all Space Wolf players run. Which, by the way, a lot of you guys might not know this, but Space Wolves are actually one of my least favorite Marine factions out of everybody, just because the Thunderwolf Cavalry, I think, looks so stupid. But anyway, that's just my personal opinion. I know a lot of people like them out there and stuff like that, but I'm so tired of them. And I really don't play them that much, but I played them so often in 5th edition when the Space Wolf Codex came out. There was this guy who just loved running them. Just big Death Stars of, Thunderwolf Cavalry, essentially. And in general, it's just really annoying, and I think they're still annoying. A lot of players still don't like Thunderwolf Cavalry. Now, there are counters to them. Wind Riders are a great counter to Thunderwolf Cavalry, especially in a big unit. If you're throwing lethal hits on them, and then on top of that, you're throwing Guide on your Wind Riders, they can really destroy a large amount of a unit. Especially when you're ignoring cover with the Warlock Skyrunner, I guarantee you guys it's one of the best ways that we have of dealing with Thunderwolf Cav. So if you are having trouble against the infamous Wolf Jail lists, then consider taking a big block of Wind Riders, a couple of units to screen, maybe some Rangers or Striking Scorpions, and you'd be surprised. You will do a lot of damage to their units. Now, fast forward till today, we are one of the lower win rate factions, but the game is pretty balanced right now, aside from a few outliers. So, being at a 47, 48% win rate as a faction is pretty good, especially considering that Eldar are a very hard faction to play, and people who bring them to tournaments, if, they're making mistakes and stuff like that, maybe they're not, the most experienced Eldari player, then they could easily lose most of their games, if not all of them. And that's not to, bring anybody down who goes to a grand tournament or something like that with the Aeldari and loses most of their games. You need to lose your games in order to learn from them, essentially. And the more you lose, the more you learn and the better player you'll become. So I think that's totally fine, honestly. And by the way, when I went to my first tournament in 5th edition, as a young strapping Aeldari player, I got absolutely wrecked. I was bringing something that was not anywhere close to competitive, and I didn't win a single game. I think the only game I ever won that day was actually when I had already been eliminated, and my friend had also been eliminated, and we played against each other off to the side in a table that wasn't being used, basically. But it was very much a learning experience, and I think for anybody who wants to go out there and, play their Eldari in a tournament, definitely go for it. But, they are a hard faction to play, and if you don't have a lot of experience with them, unfortunately, you might lose a couple more games than you expected. So, having said that, the Aeldari win rate is a little bit low, but I don't think that's that big of a deal because we have won events. It is, we've proven that we can win events and still compete with everybody else in Pariah Nexus for the most part. We do have some bad matchups, but, I think for the most part, we're still a pretty strong army in this expansion. Okay, so now the question becomes, where are we now, right? Where are the Aeldari? What kind of popular competitive builds still exist and what works? Well, I think basically it's been solidified that there's 4 popular build archetypes in Pariah Nexus as far as competitive play goes, and I want to go through them and talk about the general strategies behind each one. So the first up, of course, is Monster Mash. The second is Aspect Rush, which I still think is very popular. We have the Wraith Brick, which is still something that appears here and then and is still very popular. And of course, we have Love, Death, and Clowns coming in as our last major archetype. Now, the classic Monster Mash list is essentially an Eldar elite list. It typically consists of the Avatar of Khaine, Yin-Karn, and a Skothak Wraith Knight, alongside their supporting characters and aspects for objective play. It's a very tough list. It has powerful focus damage, and, it has a lot of durability against your traditional anti-large weapons. Usually a Farseer is along for Fortune, which makes either the Yin-Karn, the Avatar of Khaine, or the Skothak Wraith Knight extremely tough to deal with, especially when you consider they're going to be behind cover. They're going to be together in a, kind of a small area of the board to support each other. And that's the other thing. The army has a very small footprint and a lot of concentrated damage. And that's one of its weaknesses. It can't be everywhere at once. And also, if it doesn't have the damage to crack through some harder targets, then it usually stumbles pretty hard. So if you don't get that initial kind of punch with it, that 1-2 punch where you kill something, jump the Yin-Karn in there, kill a bunch of stuff, then you're going to struggle, I think, with the list in general. It's also very susceptible to mortal wound damage. So over the course of a 5-turn game, you may be able to screen well with warp spiders and stuff like that, but if your opponent has something with fly, like if you're going against Dark Eldar, for example, and you have to fight a lot of tank shock and grenades on top of course, the stratagem that, allows you to deal mortal wounds from the Raider or from the Venom and stuff like that, then you could be in a little bit of trouble, because Avatar of Khaine, Yin-Karn, and Skothak Wraith Knight all very vulnerable to mortal wounds. Thousand Suns, of course, are a very good counter to this army as well, just because they deal so many mortal wounds as well. Also being able to ignore line of sight, they can oftentimes just, kind of slowly eat up the more powerful units in the army and dismantle it piece by piece. However, I do think it is still a strong list in the right hands, in the right matchups. If you're able to press the advantages of it being very, damaging, very durable. And because it has that low footprint, if they're able to support each other, Avatar of Khaine, Yin-Karn, Skothak Wraith Knight, all able to kind of work together with their supporting aspects and units, it becomes very hard to deal with on one side of the board. And of course, that brings us to our next archetype, which is the Aspect Rush. This consists of numerous Aspect Warrior units, usually supported by Falcons and Phoenix Lords, typically Fuegan and Kahandras. Of course, though, we have seen Aspect Warrior lists run on all foot, without Falcons, without vehicles for the most part. And this kind of list, it's really fast, it's hard hitting, and it's excellent at making effective trades and scoring on secondary objectives. It tends to be weak against indirect fire, which has been nerfed, so this kind of list is a little bit stronger now, but people are still bringing indirect fire. It didn't get erased completely. In a lot of cases, the indirect fire is just basically another -1 to hit. It was hitting on a 3+. In, the Imperial Guard's case, it was hitting on a 2+. But, most cases, it's hitting on a 4+ versus a 3+ now. And it's still very good. Overwatch is a concern for this type of army as well. You have to play around Overwatch to be successful with it. And more mobile lists. So we're talking about lists that also trade effectively, that are also just as fast. Things like Dark Eldar, right? If a Dark Eldar army goes first, has a beast pack, and you don't have any screening to help you, kind of mitigate that damage, a beast pack could easily take out 1 or 2 Aspect Warrior units and consolidate into more. And really just mess up your day. So, that is a concern. Fast armies are something that this army has to be able to deal with if it's going to be effective. Okay, so the next archetype is, of course, the Wraith Brick. This is common in either a Wraith Blade Brick or a Wraith Guard Brick. And essentially, it's just what it sounds like. It runs a large unit of Wraith Guard of 10 with the supporting Farseer, Spirit Seer, and Farseer Skyrunner with aspects for secondary objective play. And it may or may not also run D-Cannons or the Avatar of Khaine alongside them. This type of list is extremely hard to shift. Wraith Guard are very good at denying areas of the board, and for an opponent that doesn't know how to deal with them and dismantle them properly, it can be extremely hard to shift. You combine that with the board control that you're getting with the D-Cannons, if you're running them, and it becomes a very scary prospect to actually engage this type of army effectively. However, this army is weak against fast, hard-hitting armies that can play around the Wraith Guard and supporting units effectively. Wraith Guard, unfortunately, they do have to shoot the unit that shoots them. So if your opponent just doesn't shoot them and charges right in, your ability is not going to be as useful. And that's really where the supporting units come in. For this type of list to be effective, like I talked about in my Wraith Guard video, you have to bring in units that can whittle down those units, those enemy units as they come, with Overwatch or Heroic Intervention with a Fights First unit and things like that to make sure that the Wraith Brick is secure. And of course, if your opponent is also able to successfully play around your supporting units, your Solitaire, your Howling Banshees, your Fights First Heroic Intervention units, or your Overwatch units like Wind Riders, then you're going to be in for a hard time. So you do have to prepare for that and make sure that your opponent can't easily get to your supporting units effectively. Okay, next we have Love, Death, and Clowns. And this is just like it says, right? An army that utilizes your Varain, the Vizark, and a large unit of Quinns to lock out a section of the board against melee units, because melee is so prevalent in this edition right now. So Pariah Nexus, of course, if you guys don't know, is the melee-centric expansion. There's so many armies that are so good at close combat that are doing really well right now. And one of the biggest counters to this is the Quinn Brick, right? The big brick of Quinns that has Fights First that can basically destroy any unit that they come across with, relative ease. Not every single melee unit, but a lot of them that are out there. They can be, of course, run as Ynnari or Aeldari alike, and alongside many Warp Spiders, Swooping Hawks, and Scorpions. You do want to run a lot of Aspect Warriors as well to kind of put pressure on your opponent. And of course, if you're running pure Aeldari, the Avatar is sometimes included in this type of list as well. As especially a Quinn Brick using Heroic Intervention against a unit that just charged into the Avatar is a great way to protect him from combat, especially the units that can kill him. It is, however, weak against anything that can either beat your Vrain's unit in combat, like Thunderwolf Cavalry, or, armies that can just ignore them. So primarily shooting armies like Tower and Imperial Guard don't care as much about this just because they don't really care about Fights First, typically. There are, of course, cases where an Imperial Guard player might want to charge in something, like a huge blob of infantry to, capture an objective. And in those cases, it is still good. But typically speaking, if the Quinn Brick is revealed, then Imperial Guard armies, Tau armies, they have enough shooting to be able to deal with it, even though it is more durable. And of course, the reason why the lists that, run your Vrain and the Quinn Brick also have fast-moving elements is because if you go up against another fast army that can just ignore the Quinn Brick, you're not going to get a lot of value out of it, right? So especially if you can kind of hop behind them. Other Eldar lists that have a lot of Warp Spiders are really, really good against this, and you do need your own Warp Spiders to counter them. Because I'm telling you guys, a couple of units of Warp Spiders jumping into the backfield will just absolutely erase every single Quinn in that unit, and will probably just leave Yvrain and the Vizark left. So there are definitely bad matchups for the Quinn Brick, no doubt, but it is a very powerful unit and a very powerful build as well. Alright, so in conclusion, the Aeldari certainly have had a fair bit of competitive evolution in 10th edition so far, but I suspect we have settled into a handful of builds that have proven to work in Pariah Nexus. And I think this will remain the case until our codex drops. I really do think we're in a very decent place. I know a lot of people will come out and say 47% win rate, 48% win rate. That's awful. That's nothing to be proud of, etc. But correct me if I'm wrong, the Aeldari in 9th edition were sitting at about a 43% win rate, and if they were lucky, a 44% win rate throughout pretty much all of the later end of 9th edition. So even though our army has been nerfed several times, we've been nerfed every single balanced data slate, let's be honest. There's some real nerf fatigue from a lot of Aeldari players out there, me included. But despite that, we're still doing pretty good. We're still winning events. And we're still able to compete in competitive play, right? I've talked to people who have a positive win rate in tournaments that are still winning RTTs with the Aeldari, that are going 5-4 in grand tournaments, and doing very well with their armies. So it's definitely not all doom and gloom. Win rate doesn't say everything. It only really says something, guys, by the way, if it's like you're number one, right? If you're the faction with the most wins, the highest win rate in the game, then it starts to say a little bit of something about your faction. But if you're somewhere in the middle, it really doesn't say much, right? I mean, we are so close to so many other armies within a single percentage point of so many other factions. And I really just think that comes down to Eldar are harder to play than those other factions, quite simply. And that's why we have that lower win rate. So I wouldn't worry too much about it. And I think we're going to have another balance, kind of patch coming out pretty soon to adjust points and things like that. So we should be getting some buffs on certain units, and we'll probably get some nerfs. And I'm going to give you guys my predictions on what I think is going to get nerfed. It's going to be pretty obvious. I think you guys can guess what those units are going to be in the comment section below based on all of the competitive lists that have come out recently. But it's going to be fun to see what buffs we get as well and what new kind of builds we can maybe work around with. I do, kind of think in general the archetypes are going to stay the same, but we might be able to play with some new toys. And of course, as always, here's me crossing my fingers and praying that Corsairs get a significant points decrease. I think if we saw Corsairs get, a 10-point decrease, maybe even a 20-point decrease per unit, I think we'd see them being run a lot more in competitive play. And, I'm hoping for that, but we'll see. We'll see. Okay, so lastly, before we end this video, I do want to address something that I think some of you might be a little bit creeped out by, and that is the AI, kind of generated music that I uploaded on the channel a couple days ago. And just to address any concerns you guys might have about that, obviously that's not going to be my main content. It never was going to be. I just, wanted to have some fun with it. I'm having some trouble with my, video editing recently through Adobe Express. And recently my Wraith Blade video just got completely deleted from Adobe Express. So, thanks Adobe for that. So my other content has not been as consistent. I can definitely understand the concern there. But having said that, I thought they were funny to make. And, cringy humor, I know some of you guys think it's pretty cringe, but cringy humor is kind of funny to me. I find it hilarious. So, I thought I would just post that and, see what you guys thought about it just so we could have a laugh together. But that's about it. It's not to be taken seriously. I know some of you guys out there are really anti-AI, and I just want to mention this, that, I'm of course not trying to take away from any real artists by, posting AI music or anything like that, because let's be real, no artist would actually do something like this for real. No artist is going to go up there and sing and write lyrics for the 40K universe. No artist out there that I know of is, actively making money doing this for real and not incorporating AI into their work. And I do happen to know somebody who does work in the music industry. And, I know there's a lot of work that goes into it. I've been in the studio. I've seen all the, blood, sweat, and tears that artists pour into their work. And, I'm not trying to take that away from anybody. I'm just creating something that I think the Eldar community can appreciate, laugh at, have a little joke about it. AI is a pretty wild thing. I think that for the most part, you guys that, don't like AI or that, think that AI is stealing jobs away from real artists, I agree with you. But you guys really do need to direct your energy towards those big corporations who are legitimately stealing work away from artists and not paying them and just using AI to do a bunch of their work, right? And they're making a huge profit because of that. So yeah, I just thought I would address that really quick, let you guys know my thoughts on it, let you guys know my plans on that kind of, that kind of content. It's really not going to be a big part of the channel, but, I had a niche for it and I just wanted to try it out, do a little something with it. Okay, so anyway, I have some new videos coming out later this week. We're going to have that Wraith Blade video coming out. I'm just going to re-record the whole thing and just get it out to you guys as soon as possible. I had some really good points that I think you guys will enjoy, so try to, kind of capture those again. And we also have a battle against Thousand Suns coming up. So great news. I'm going to be able to make a video finally covering Thousand Suns, how to defeat the Thousand Suns and stuff like that. I'm going to have an extensive conversation with somebody who's played Thousand Suns for about 3 years now. I know that's not that much time in the wider scheme of things, but, he's been playing them pretty regularly in 10th edition. He knows the army pretty well. So I will say this, though, I don't know him personally. He was kind of a buddy of one of the people in my gaming group who doesn't usually come around because he lives over an hour away. So, we kind of agreed to meet kind of midway at a different hobby store. So hopefully within the next couple of weeks, we can find a time to meet up and we can, play a game against each other and kind of discuss strategies and tactics and stuff like that. So I will relay that information to you guys in a video. And again, I'm hoping to get a couple of videos out on the topic within the next week or two. So stay tuned for that as well. And we'll have other content in between also. All right, everybody, that is going to be it for today's video. Thanks for watching. Thank you so much to all my patrons and supporters for supporting the channel over the last 2 years. It's almost 2 years now. When it hits October, it will be officially 2 years. We're trying to reach 5K subs. If you haven't subscribed, please do so we can reach that milestone before the 2-year mark is over. It would definitely mean a lot to me, and I would really appreciate it. So if you do feel so inclined, thank you very much. Also, if you do want to support the channel in other ways, I have Patreon free trials activated, which will grant you access to our Discord community for no cost to you. And of course, our Discord community is one of the best in 40K. We're a very friendly community that likes to talk about strategies, tactics, and of course, hobbying. And I will also leave the link for that in the description below. I'm an Amazon associate, and I also have a store page. So if you want to check out my store page for some discounted Eldar, inspired apparel, or you want to grab some discounted Eldar miniatures from Amazon, I will leave the links in the description for those also. All right, everybody, that's going to be it for today's video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys next time. Have a good one, everybody. Peace out.